was sad to forgo in building this presentation. This is definitely a condensed version of a lot more work that I've been doing. So there's my email right there. If anybody's interested in the full notes, I'd be happy to provide those. Otherwise, let's get started. I hope you all have seen this show before. This is the BBC's Sherlock, their modernization of Doyle's work. In this particular episode, in The Hounds of Baskerville, Sherlock says to Watson, "It was more than fear, I felt doubt. I've always been able to trust my senses, the evidences of my own eyes, until last night." "You can't actually believe you saw some sort of monster," Watson says, and Sherlock says, "No, I can't believe it, but I did see it, so the question is how." This attitude is one that typifies the Enlightenment philosophy leading into the modernist period of the 1920s and 30s. However, in the midst of this period, Howard Phillips Lovecraft examined the changing times from a different perspective than many of his peers. He says, "The time has come when the normal revolt against time, space, and matter must assume a form not overtly incompatible with what we know of reality, when it must be gratified by images forming supplements rather than contradictions of the visible and measurable universe." In essence, Lovecraft claims that these destabilizing agents, the roots of horror, are not overtly incompatible with a new materialist worldview. Contradiction destroys credibility, but if the system is supplemented with more weight than it can handle, it will collapse and take the world with it. Now, Lovecraft's fiction in the late 1920s follows the method of destabilization from within in a way that is astoundingly similar to the work of French philosopher Jacques Derrida and his concepts of deconstruction that would be laid out until the late 1970s. However, even as Lovecraft employs what might come to be called postmodern methods in the modernist age, he and Derrida seem to come to very different conclusions. Today I'll be presenting Lovecraft's The Call of Cthulhu, The Color Out of Space, and At the Mountains of Madness as not only critical readings of Enlightenment rationalism, but also anticipatory critiques of postmodern idealism. Examining Lovecraft on the spectrum of modernism requires working definitions of modernism and postmodernism, and Peter Berry provides these quite nicely in his book Beginning Theory. In a word, the modernist laments fragmentation, and the postmodernist celebrates it. To use the analogy of a broken lens, modernism begins at the moment where the lens of religious thought in the early 20th century cracks, more or less, and human rationalism has been provided as a sort of improved prescription, the means by which the possibility of progress could survive the fallout of the Great War. This can especially be seen in the philosophy of the German Jürgen Habermas. But Habermas himself was disgruntled by other responses to fragmentation, which Berry says attacked, in his view, the ideals of reason, clarity, truth, and progress. These attacks can be most succinctly summarized by Jacques Derrida in On Grammatology. There is no such thing as outside of the text. Consider a rubber band ball. You typically begin with a ball upon which is built a lattice work of rubber bands. Whatever the composition of this central ball, in this case a baseball, it is not itself a rubber band, and so it is something different from the structure of bands surrounding it. Similarly, according to Derrida, the central idea of a system of discourse is not itself a part of the language, or the system used to explain it. Attempting to make the center a part of the system, trying to turn the ball into a rubber band, might as well cause it to cease to exist, at least outside of language. Further, language and discourse form a lattice work around an objective reality, and the inherent difference between language and reality means that the central reality is never quite touched. From here, Derrida can argue what is perhaps best said as there is nothing outside context. As such, the human condition is one doomed to subjective interpretation, or what he calls play. This implies that, in a very real way, human knowledge is far closer to and dependent upon stories than it is upon data derived from experiments. Indeed, our interpretations of such data form stories in their own right. Human perception might reveal, say, 98% of the world, but the remainder contains infinite context and is quite capable of recontextualizing everything we think we know. In fact, in Structure, Sign, and Play, and the Discourse of the Human Sciences, Derrida argues that this describes the entirety of human history. In dealing with this great uncertainty, Derrida excitedly seeks a difference, a sort of transcendental synthesis of ideas, and as yet unnameable, which is proclaiming itself, he says, and can only be thus far conceived, quote, in the formless, mute, infant, and terrifying form of monstrosity. Sound familiar? The uncertain relationship between language and reality becomes a singularity in which it's language all the way down, and the ride is meant to be enjoyed one connection after the next, for all eternity. For Lovecraft, however, it may indeed be language all the way down, but our trip through the abyss is by no means survivable. At some point, human discourse fails to deliver on its potential, and all that remains is the unnameable. In Lovecraft's fiction, the monstrous does not represent an infinite potential for reading and interpretation. On the contrary, as in the horror at Red Hook, es las sich nicht lesen. It does not permit itself to be read. In particular, these dynamics can be seen in the Call of Cthulhu, the Color Out of Space, and at the Mountains of Madness, making two significant contributions to the dialogue between modernism and postmodernism. First, they demonstrate that, as put by scholar Eric Davis, it is not the sleep of reason that breeds monsters, but reason with its eyes agog. Lovecraft recognizes that the Enlightenment project confines the human understanding of reality to what he calls, quote, galling limitations which forever imprison us and frustrate our curiosity about the infinite cosmic spaces beyond the radius of our psychoanalysis. Human knowledge is incomplete by definition, yet as will be seen, honest rationalism remains capable of revealing more than it can handle. Second, Lovecraft anticipates the postmodern reaction to uncertainty, and he levels any sense of optimism. Derrida's excitement hinges on the idea that language and context can indeed go on forever, but Lovecraft says that this is simply not the case. If the human relationship with reality is fundamentally textual and based on narrative, and that relationship continues beyond our psychoanalysis, then it is far more likely to destroy us than to free us. For this reason, Lovecraft finds it necessary to explore the concepts of weird fiction, as he says in his notes. It must be remembered that any violation of what we know as natural law is in itself a most tremendous thing, and characters should show the same overwhelming emotions which they would show in real life. In Lovecraft's fiction, this real-life emotional response is invariably paralyzing fear and madness, which destabilizes confidence in the predictability of human experience. Of course, we also will do anything we can to escape these emotions under threats of uncertainty. We work to valorize our own experiences, asking with Sherlock exactly how we see the monsters instead of acknowledging that they might be there. Or as wise men are wont to say in The Color Out of Space, stones don't shrink. In this most well-known of Lovecraft's tales, materialism is presented as a system of discourse for discovering truth, but it is a system which reduces that truth to an acceptable paradigm. Each of the sciences pulls in its own direction, he says, and the resulting tension tells us just enough about the universe to find our way in it. However, the sciences maintain that the only acceptable evidences are those that fit within their respective paradigms. So when Francis Thurston is confronted with his great-uncle's research into the questions of Cthulhu, he discounts circumstantial evidence with what he calls almost inexplicable perversity, as he works to discover hard facts regarding the case, but such evidence is never turned up, and he is forced to return to the, quote, coincidences of the dream notes and odd cuttings collected by Professor Engel. Thurston admits that the attitude which led him to dismiss such information was, quote, one of absolute materialism, as I wish it still were. As such, this a priori commitment to materialism leads Thurston to some very irrational conduct in the early stages of his investigation. Thurston's experience ultimately forces him to accept that truth discovered through text and narrative places him in better epistemic position than one arrived at through the materialist paradigm. If Thurston had followed the scientific method to the letter, then his investigation would never have started in the first place, as no lead would have been worth following. But by widening the scope of acceptable evidence, Thurston's world soon becomes much bigger than he can handle. He is one step closer to doing complete knowledge, but at the cost of his safety and the relevance of his life. This leads to the story's paradoxical ending. Quote, with Johansson's account shall go this record of mine, this test of my own sanity, wherein is pieced together that which I hope may never be pieced together again. Thurston's own account now takes on the status of textual evidence, one more narrative in an incredible story. Not only does he have no empirical evidence whatsoever to show for his investigation, but his reassessment of what makes for good evidence means that he knows of no better evidence than his own testimony. No one pursuing his investigation anew would ever discover or accept his account unless they too dismantled for themselves their pre-existing opinions about acceptable evidence, and this is something that Thurston hopes never happens. In The Color Out of Space, Lovecraft questions the omniscience of scientific inquiry by presenting it with something which cannot be examined, but most unsettling is the nebulous, lacking description of the horror itself. Here, we find one of the best treatments of Lovecraft's unnameable as the human agents within the story work to describe something for which there are no words. It is here that Lovecraft begins to explore the limits of language, a language that Derrida would deny. While Derrida would argue that the imprecision of language creates spaces of infinite context, even between an actual stone and the word stone, Lovecraft explores the gulf that is even wider and darker. Taking Derrida's concept of infinite context to heart, even a more informed description of the color would remain so imprecise as to do nothing to bridge the gap between us and it. It would remain alien on the other side of infinite context. The implication on human perception and relationship in general becomes very bleak indeed. Further, the color represents a complete denial of material laws and absolutes. It is even suggested that the entity obeys its own set of laws. But these are things that are so different from any that govern humanity. As such, the line between the natural and the supernatural becomes hopelessly blurred as human perception and experience becomes an awfully insufficient baseline for understanding the greater cosmos. The color represents an endpoint to human interaction, a selectively permeable sort of reality where certain things such as itself are allowed back and forth, but humanity is not. In our abilities to interact and to conceive, we are the eternal victims of our own subjectivity and, as Lovecraft said, galling limitations. In At the Mountains of Madness, Lovecraft most thoroughly addresses the questions of recontextualization and the limits of language. Lovecraft plays with the human reliance on language and how its limits coincide with our own limits. Limits which, according to Davis, paradoxically point to the beyond. The existence of something which cannot be described and so cannot enter into our system of discourse or understanding is the typical central wonder in Lovecraft's stories. And his anticipation of the human reaction is one of mental breakdown or denial, as opposed to the assimilation that Nietzsche or Derrida would have hoped for. We have words to form the phrase windowless solids with 5 dimensions, but the human mind has no image to attach to these words. It cannot keep up with the infinite. Most telling, however, is the moment where the limits of language actually cause the recontextualization that damns humanity. And this is the point when the narrator refers to the old ones as, quote, men. That those things which make men men, all these concepts and values which contribute to our ideas about what it means to be human, are better represented in the old ones than in our own species. Again, the degree to which humanity is decentered and recontextualized by this revelation is immense. As the narrative of the old ones places the aliens at the center of interpretive authority in such a way that humans can no longer make any claims towards knowledge or authority of any kind. One might argue that humans have been inherited the potential of the process, but it has already been demonstrated that humans have nowhere near the capacity for conception that their masters had. We are merely the flotsam of a ship that has already attempted a descent into an infinite maelstrom and been ruined by it. Any argument that Lovecraft's deconstruction of the Enlightenment project betrays contempt for science and reason is certainly erroneous. Nothing was more important to the man, but what he does seem to be stressing, however, is the fallibility of the human element where these things are concerned, demonstrating that humanity's constructs will necessarily be as limited as it is. Lovecraft would undoubtedly have resonated with Dana Scully's musings of the X-Files. If science serves me to these ends, it is not lost on me that the tool I have come to depend on absolutely cannot save me or protect me, only bring into focus the darkness that lies ahead. It is this tension between the reality of the infinite and the insufficiency of human experience, this clash of modernism and postmodernism, which makes Lovecraft so compelling. He presents modernism as a replacement tyranny, and honest rationalism becomes, as Davis says, the ultimate Faustian bargain, because it leads us beyond the horizon of what our minds can withstand. Lovecraft betrays the central paradox of materialism, that it can achieve absolute mastery and knowledge for humanity only by severely limiting what that knowledge and mastery entail. No finite being can create an infinite system by which to attain absolute knowledge. Simultaneously, Lovecraft, quote, marks the limits of language and so signs the death sentence of Derrida's, quote, new Nietzschean world before it was ever articulated. Just as no human construct can be infinite, the finitude of human beings can make no sense of the infinite potentials of language. In fact, when confronted with them, we break. Yet he also validates the work of the postmodernists, demonstrating that context is indeed infinite, and from within that infinity there is yet something staring back at us. In all of this, Lovecraft seems to acknowledge in both philosophies the propensity for humans under the threat of the uncontrollable to construct concepts of a perceivable, predictable universe. Microbiologist Richard Lewontin demonstrates that contemporary modes of discourse within the sciences continue the same propensity. Quote, there is no observations without an immense apparatus of pre-existing theory. Repeatable observations that do not fit into an existing frame have a way of disappearing from view. The suggestion that only demonologists engage in special pleading, often to rescue a proposition in deep rhetorical trouble, is certainly not one that accords with my reading of the scientific literature. In Lovecraft's stories, persons of high intelligence jeer at the endmost mysteries, and his characters argue, quote, if superior minds were ever placed in fullest contact with the secrets preserved by ancient and lowly cults, they would soon not only wreck the world, but threaten the very integrity of the universe. And here the deconstructive lens, forgive me, turns on Lovecraft himself. He paints a universe that is ultimately bleak and purposeless, the product of an anti-god, yet that cosmos also exhibits an agency upon its constituent pieces. one capable of achieving this fullest contact that threatens to destabilize human self-centeredness and confidence in experience. Though the miracles of this universe utterly ruin those who experience them, Lovecraft, in his atheism, quoting from Derrida, can pronounce not a single destructive position that has not already had to slip into the form, the logic, and the implicit postulations of precisely what it seeks to contest. And this, Derrida would say, is the heart of deconstruction. However unintelligent or unwillful or indifferent or malign it may be, his cosmos remains supernatural, at least alongside the finite capacities of human beings, and, quote, it does not permit itself to be read. In light of this infinite context which Derrida demonstrates, and to which Lovecraft tirelessly delved years before, we find that humans have the propensity to either shrink their world down into something manageable, or to conflate it into more than it truly is. We place ourselves at the center of our philosophies, yet it seems humans make for a very poor focal point of interpretive authority. We are clearly unequipped to sail the waters of infinity, and so we ask, with Lovecraft even today, what else is out there taking us with it?